Welcome to Retraced Echoes, where we're going to be diving into one of the most violent and terrifying paranormal hauntings ever documented. We're talking about the San Pedro Haunting. The story centers around a woman named Jackie Hernandez, whose experiences, some claim, are amongst the most legitimate and disturbing poltergeist cases on record. Now, I didn't know a whole lot about this case, if we're being completely honest. I ended up watching a podcast called the Lights Out Podcast and thought to myself, well, I want to talk about this story too. So once you get done listening to my podcast, if you want to go check out theirs is significantly longer than probably what this is going to be. Theirs was an hour and 45 minutes. So we're going to be doing a much more condensed version here, but hopefully you enjoy it. Now, setting the stage of our story is going to begin in the winter of 1988 when 23-year-old Jackie Hernandez was pregnant with her second child. Now, around this time, her relationship with her husband, Al Hernandez, it was falling apart. Now, what was truly unsettling to her was not the fact that her marriage was falling apart. It was the fact that inside of her own home, she could feel the presence of someone else. She would have reoccurring nightmares night after night, and she would wake up at exactly midnight, often from the same exact reoccurring dream. Now, in it, she found herself in the shoes of a young man walking along the shore of the San Pedro Harbor in a setting that looked like it was probably from the 1900s. Now, suddenly, she was attacked, clubbed with a lead pipe, and she drowned in the harbor's waters. Now, the dreams, they felt so real that Jackie had experienced pretty much a terror of being held underwater, gasping for air until she would ultimately drown. At the time, Jackie, she didn't know what, if any, significance the nightmares had, but it bothered her. It bothered her really bad. I think that it would probably most anybody, and they kept happening night after night after night. Now, one thing that I always find fascinating when I tell these stories is how often nighttime and midnight will prop up in the lore. Now, some say that it's the witching hour, a time where the veil between the worlds is thinner. It makes me wonder if, when we look at the story we just told, possibly Jackie's stress or the pregnancy with her second child, her marriage falling apart, maybe if that amplified all of this. I mean, nightmares, they could possibly be a way of processing trauma, or perhaps something darker, latching on to the fear. Now, by early the following year, she would give birth to her daughter Samantha. And of course, unfortunately, Jackie would separate from Al. Now, the split, it was relatively chill between the two. I mean, Jackie took care of the 2-year-old Jamie and the newborn Samantha, but Al, he remained involved in their lives. But when we look at the actual haunting, what makes Jackie's experience so remarkable are the fact that there was so many violent incidences that was linked to the haunting. I mean, over time, investigators would document pretty extensively the paranormal activity, everything from photographs to videos and firsthand testimonies. Now, many was convinced that this was obviously a case of poltergeist, given the aggressive nature of the unseen entity. Now, some would point out that despite its shocking details, Jackie's ordeal had never received the same level of attention as other famous cases, mostly because it was overshadowed by blockbuster movies like the Amityville Horror and the high-profile investigations of the Warrens, especially in the late 1990s. Now, even so, many have studied the San Pedro Haunting, regarding it as one of the most legitimate and intense hauntings in American history. Now, Jackie moved into a small home on West 11th Street in San Pedro, California. Now, the one thing to understand is she was working full-time and she was still taking classes at night just to try to advance her career, but she was still doing her best to balance motherhood, her work, and her school. Now, essentially, you have to remember she was a single parent at this point. But with all of this stuff going on and all this frustration that was just mounting, she had this overwhelming nagging sense of unease whenever she was in her new house. Late one night, she heard a knock at the door. Now, she was fearing the worst being a break-in, so she very hesitantly answered the door. but she only found her ex-husband, Al, on the porch. Now, he had said that his temporary rental that he was just in, it had caught fire. So he's asking to stay with Jackie for just a few weeks. Now, she was very reluctant at this, but she allowed him to stay. Relieved at first that the house might feel a little bit safer with anything just another adult inside the home. Now, not long after Al moved in, Jackie started experiencing what many would consider the very beginning of the haunting. A pencil holder? It unexplainably flew off the table when neither she nor Al was even remotely close to touching it. Now, she tried to just dismiss it as nothing, maybe just a draft. But small unsettling events, they started to pile up. Items went missing, and then they would turn up in very odd places. At times, Jackie felt as though there was invisible eyes that was watching her from all the dark corners. Even her cat began to act very strangely, arching his back at empty air and appearing to follow something unseen across the room. You know, one of the things that I want to talk about, and we've talked about it multiple times in other podcasts, there's really two things I want to talk about. There always seems to be recurring things that happen over and over and over again. And in this case, we're talking about something that flies right off of a table, typical paranormal poltergeist activity. But what I find interesting is I'm starting to notice an abundance of stories where things will disappear from one location and end up in a completely different location. Typically, I consider that just my wife moving my stuff. But in these stories, this happens a lot. You know, one of the big things that I talk about, there was a location, the Hinsdale property, and I was talking to both Paul and to Link, who's over at the Dandy Paranormal House channel, or the Dandy House on Facebook and YouTube. I'll leave a link in the description down below. And then Link has his own channel, the Link Paranormal Network, or the Link Dandy Paranormal Network. Anyway, I'll leave links in the description down below. You know, one of the things that they would talk about is things will just disappear and then they'll find them later somewhere completely different. Paul said that that happened a lot, especially with Clara at the Dandy House. And Link has talked about that also. Just from a paranormal investigation standpoint, he would have something in a spot where it should be, and then it just flat out disappears. Now, I think it's easy for most of us to just look at things and think, well, you know, I must have just moved this somewhere else and forgot where I moved it. But what if that is not the case at all? And how many reoccurrences of these things have to happen before you go, oh, wait, no, that's paranormal? You know, when we talk about the thing flying off the desk, I think a lot of things could be rational for that. But when she said that it was a draft, or her just being scatterbrained, especially when her and Al is nowhere near this thing, it's kind of hard to assume that this thing just flew off of its location in any direction, right? It goes back to just basic science. Things just don't fly off of a location. And also, how many of these occurrences, like I said, would have to pile up before you go, this is paranormal? I mean, if you got one thing flying off here and another thing flying off there, I would almost assume that if you don't count the first one, how many do you have to count before you go, well, there's something there, it's clearly paranormal? Now, for Jackie in this story specifically, each unexplained event, it definitely chipped away at her sense of safety. Almost like the house was building tension, just one piece at a time. And another conversation that I've had on my other podcast is that sometimes I feel like these things happen to invoke fear, which we'll be talking about a little bit later in the podcast also. But anyway, back to the story. Before long, Al found a brand new place and he left. Alone again with the children, Jackie, she started to dread being in the house alone by herself. All that dread, it all returned. One evening, she finally had the kids put to sleep. She settled down in the living room for some much needed rest. Then she heard what sounded like pebbles, almost like they were tapping or rolling inside the walls. Startled, Jackie pressed her ear up to the drywall, wondering if maybe it's the sound of rodents that were kind of scurrying around on the wall. But any mundane explanation, it vanished as soon as she heard very slow and deliberate footsteps moving across the attic floor that was right above her. Now, with no one else in the house, Jackie's fear, it grew stronger than ever before. Now, a few nights passed without any kind of further disturbances, so in Jackie's mind, she thought to herself, you know what I'm hearing upstairs, what I thought was footsteps, is probably just my imagination, and the sounds that was in the wall, that was probably just a small rodent. Maybe they got a piece of food, or maybe there's a piece of plaster that dropped off the side of the wall, and that's what caused the noise. And then my imagination started rolling with it, and I thought I heard the footsteps. That's so crazy. I think that is probably relatively normal for most people to try to, if anything, be skeptical and let that out of their mind. So since she felt relatively calm about everything now, one evening she decided to invite her friend and her neighbor Susan over. Of course, after the kids had went to bed. Now, while they were talking, Jackie, she had mentioned, I think I've heard maybe some strange noises in the wall, almost like a pebble rolling inside the walls. And you know what? It's probably just my imagination, but I thought I heard like these very slow and small footsteps above. Now, no sooner that she had told Susan all of this, there was a loud crash that happened inside the kitchen. Now, they rushed in and they found a painting that had fallen from the wall. Not a huge deal, right? Just creepy circumstance, except there was 2 nails that had been holding it up that had fallen down on the floor, and they fell on the tip of their head. It was just standing straight up. Now, it was strange enough that not just one nail, like what's the odds that one nail would fall perfectly on the end and stay that way? But the fact that there was 2, it seemed almost not necessarily coincidental that this thing happened right after Jackie had mentioned the very eerie noises that she thought that she was hearing. Now, one of the things that I want to talk about before we get too much further into this story, what is it about attics that always seem to be like the epicenter of spooky encounters? We talk about attics quite often, or basements. One of the people that I did an interview on my channel a while back, at the Wildwood Sanitarium, Brooke, who's the owner, was telling me that up in the attic, there was a dark entity. They call it the Thing. And it really makes me wonder, because a lot of these stories do talk about entities being in either the attic or the basement. And I'm wondering if maybe it is the isolation, or just that we very seldom go to those locations, and it turns into somewhat of like an echo chamber for just our imaginations. Like maybe it's not necessarily that there is something there, but because we rarely go into those locations, and sometimes they're dark and they can be a little bit eerie, maybe it is just our imaginations that take a root when we talk about those locations, especially when we talk about paranormal stories. The one thing that I will say is that in Jackie's case, the noises, they went beyond imagination. When we talk about deliberate footsteps, especially in a space that's supposedly empty, that for me holds a little bit more weight. When I was a kid, I remember my grandparents lived in this, it was like a farmhouse, is the best way that I can put it. And in the evenings, we would hear what sounded like very deliberate footsteps that would go up the steps. Now, another thing that people love to say is, well, it's just the house setting. And you can assume that that's a footstep, right? Like one, like you hear it setting and you go, was that a footstep, or did I just hear the house setting? But when you hear very deliberate steps that's moving, and in Jackie's case, a very slow footstep. For me, it holds a little bit more weight. And then when we look at the picture or the photo that was on the wall, I've had pictures fall a lot of times, and generally it's just, Bert didn't hang them quite right. But nails landing upright, especially side by side, the two nails, that's a very odd coincidence. In fact, I think it would be a very impossible coincidence. Now, some might call it a trick of gravity, and others, like myself, they'll just call it a calling card from beyond. I think we can all agree the fact that two nails would land side by side, perfectly standing up, it's going to be a mighty hard thing unless it's one of the two. It's either gravity stopped working for one weird instance, or it's a lie. In this case, two people saw it, or the third option is it's somebody trying to get your attention from beyond. But anyway, Susan tried not to alarm her friends, so she would pick up the painting she would lay to the side, and soon they would call it a night. As the evening would go by, almost as though it was trying to get her attention, there was the soft tapping in the walls that continued, and they would go on through the next day. Now Jackie, she decided to finally check the attic. A friend had told her a story about finding some money hidden in an old San Pedro house, and Jackie thought, well, heck, maybe it would be her lucky day. Finally, something good that's happening from this entire experience. She would end up standing on top of her washing machine and opening the attic hatch. The space above, it was dim, and it was empty. After a moment, Jackie felt a very intense feeling of being watched, like someone was right behind her, just staring. She turned around to see nothing at first, but the sense of the presence, it only grew stronger. Suddenly, she saw what looked like a man's head, round-faced and solid, rushing towards her from the far side of the attic. Now terror overwhelmed her. Without thinking, Jackie's legs, they just gave out. She lost her footing and tumbled off the washing machine. Her friend, who was standing below, never saw the apparition, but she did see Jackie's face go pale and her body collapse. Now, for a few moments, Jackie couldn't stand. She was too shaken to even move. The fleeting glimpse of a disembodied head was by far the most frightening thing that she had ever experienced in her entire life. And though she tried, if anything, to rationalize what she had seen, the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears told her that there was no easy explanation for what lurked up in the attic. When we talk about ghost sightings, they oftentimes come as like a fleeting glimpse of something, a face or a silhouette. Many people will say it's oftentimes just a form of pareidoia, but it's very rare that a full, clear figure like you see in the movies ever occur, at least in these stories. Now, for me personally, I've seen what looks like a normal person, just like myself or you that's potentially watching right now on YouTube. Just regular people. Now, what Jackie saw was vivid enough to knock her off her feet, literally. The kind of shock that can make believers out of even the biggest skeptics, at least in the moment. Now, Jackie tried to push aside what she had seen in the attic, but, the fear, it lingered. She needed some time away from the house, so she hired her babysitter named Tina. Now, Jackie said nothing to Tina about any of the strange things that was happening inside of her home. Why? Well, she said she didn't want to scare her off, of course. Now, later that night, while checking in on the children, Tina reached for the bedroom door and watched it creak open all on its own before she could even touch it. Now, she reassured herself that it had to be a draft, right? Or possibly an uneven door frame. I mean, she didn't live here, so she didn't know, but the moment It still left her very unsettled. When Jackie returned, Tina quietly mentioned the very odd thing that happened. Now, Jackie's expression was that of genuine concern, and Tina, as soon as she had that babysitter money in hand, she dipped, she was gone. She's like, I'm out. Never coming back. So not long after this, they had to hire another babysitter. Let's talk about Miss Chrissy. She would come over one evening. As Jackie explained the children's bedtime routine in the kitchen, she noticed a circular light that was hovering right around the top of the ceiling. It slowly pulsed, and then it split into multiple glowing orbs, spinning and drifting around in midair. Now, unsure that anyone would believe them, they snapped a photograph of the bizarre lights. Now, this marked the very first time Jackie had physical evidence of something truly unexplainable that was happening inside their home. I don't know how many of you have actually seen, obviously we talk about stories about orbs and lights. And most of them, especially when we talk about photographs, it comes down to it's just dust particles. I myself, in my teenage years, had seen what I believed to be that of an orb. And it was very interesting. The house that we lived in had very tall doorways, and there was a glass pane that was above the door. And that glass pane, I believe, could shift in and out. We never did. We always just left it solid. And one evening I watched what looked like a orb come in and go through that glass partition, go through my room very slowly. This was not quickly. It would make a few rotations and it would go right back out that glass panel and then vanish. So I've seen it firsthand. One thing that I will mention in this case, when the babysitter sees something, it adds credibility. It's one thing for a homeowner to experience some type of paranormal thing and be like, hey, I'm having these ghost experiences. But an outsider? Someone who walks into someone else's home and sees something themselves, do you not think that adds some credibility? And Chrissy's photograph of those glowing orbs, even if you're skeptical about orbs, it makes you wonder what she actually captured. Out of curiosity, what do you think of the photo that I'm including here? If you're listening on audio, I'm sorry. You might want to check out the YouTube video later. I'm curious what others will think of this photo of the orbs. Soon, things turned even more disturbing. Jackie noticed a gooey substance, almost like blood, that was oozing down her kitchen walls and cabinets. The foul-smelling liquid. It was collected and analyzed, and lab results indicated that it was a human male blood plasma with high levels of copper and iodine, suggesting some form of decay. Now, the mere thought of this substance coming from decomposing body was almost too horrifying to even bear. You know, another thing that I think about, when we look at these cases, not the first time that we've ever heard of something like a bleeding wall. It seems to show up in several famous hauntings, but Jackie's sample tests of the human male blood plasma, now that's next level disturbing. If lab results were actually accurate in this case, think about it. Now, some will say that she was just faking the plasma. You know, maybe it was planted. But some of us will say it was possibly something truly horrific that was seeping from the walls. Now, in addition to all of this, objects, they also began launching themselves across the room. Now it was next level. It wasn't just little cup holders. Now, although Jackie had already experienced plenty of eerie events, flying pencil holders, odd noises, vanishing objects, the appearance of blood that seemed to be coming down the walls, she could no longer dismiss the possibility that something truly malevolent had taken root in her home, and every new sign of activity, it only deepened her growing dread. Now, Jackie feared that she was starting to lose her mind. Outside of Chrissy and her close friend Susan, there was no one else who she could comfortably confine in, except for Al, her estranged husband. Although separated, they remained pretty much generally on good terms, so she invited him over, and she explained everything. Now, he was clearly unconvinced. He dismissed her experiences, and he just thought it was a case that she was just really lonely. To prove there was no supernatural at play, Al loudly challenged any entity in the house to show itself. When the house remained silent, he declared there was nothing to fear, and he left. Now, shortly after he was gone, Jackie, she discovered something unsettling in her closet. The name Al. It was repeatedly wrote in bright red and blue. The writing covered the entire wall, cover to cover, convinced that this was a direct message to Al's taunt. She snapped another photo to document the evidence. Now, some poltergeist accounts, they mention writing on walls or personal belongings that are within, different spots. One of those we did a podcast on relatively recently. I can't remember the name of it. But it would write responses on the actual wall. It could almost feel like direct harassment or like a call out, especially if it's the name of someone and that's somebody who challenged the actual entity. In this case, it was Al. And it's like, okay, Al, here's an entire wall with your name. And think about the length of time that would take. We're talking cover to cover with the name Al. It's like a supernatural graffiti. Or the next question would be, much like the other story that we had told, probably a year back. Maybe it was a case of human hands. Now, the question I would have is why? Like, what's the point? If Al already left, even if she told the story to Al, who would believe it? Around the same time, Jackie began walking at midnight, and she would sense a presence in her children's bedroom. One night, by the faint glow of like a nightlight that was inside the room, she saw an elderly man sitting cross-legged on the empty bunk. His skin, it looked gray and decayed, and he wore a red flannel shirt, work pants, and heavy boots. In the instant that he had met her gaze, he vanished. In hauntings, apparitions can look just like living people, which is what I mentioned earlier. I had myself personally saw what I believe was that of my great-grandmother. When I was a kid, I was probably 4 or 5 years old. But one thing that some of these cases do is they talk about entities that look human, but maybe they have something different, in this case, gray skin. Sometimes you hear stories where it's like hollow eyes. Jackie described him as decaying, and dressed in flannel suggests a very vivid and memorable detail. Could that possibly be a residual imprint that's locked in time? We talk about residual hauntings all the time, and maybe this is the case at this residence. Or is there an intelligence presence that's actively targeting her family? Now, with no money to move, Jackie felt trapped in the house. Her nerves, they were completely screwed up, just dealing with the struggles of raising 2 young children, not having a man in the house, holding down a full-time job, attending classes. My goodness. During a walk with Susan, Jackie began to have a breakdown. Just by coincidence, they ran into Jackie's landlord, and Susan decided to speak up, detailing the strange noises, the apparitions, the unnerving discoveries. Far from dismissing them, the landlord, she offered to send 2 priests to bless the home. Desperate for any kind of relief, Jackie was like in total agreement. She was ready. Maybe this is what she needed. The next day, the 2 priests, they came to evaluate the situation. They found the house in disarray, papers and boxes and clothes spewed all over the place, and they assumed Jackie was just a simple, extremely busy mom with little to no time to tidy up. But beneath the everyday mess, something else lurked. The mounting evidence that a dark force had claimed her San Pedro home, and neither priest nor prayer might be enough to send it away. Now, the investigators, they tried several times to put a camera up in the attic. They would push it through that very small hole. It would end up shutting off, and once they would bring it back down, the camera would power back up normally. The pattern had kept repeating itself over and over and over again. Although they managed to record a few minutes of footage here and there, the equipment, it was frequently malfunctioning, especially when Jeff Wheatcraft went in alone. You know, another thing that we talk about a lot of times when we talk about haunted locations is the fact that batteries will drain in certain objects, or there will be glitches or malfunctions in equipment. You know, one of the things that I see relatively commonly is this little thing right here. Now, for those of you that's listening on the audio, sorry, you'll want to check out the YouTube, but you know, these oh, look at that. Sorry, all of those in the audible world. That's kind of cool. Anyway, these laser grids and stuff like that, whenever there's a laser that's attached, these things, they go dead a lot. I hear that a lot when it comes to paranormal locations. And here's the thing, like in this case, if mine's working perfectly well here, but then when I go to a location, it starts to fail, is that evidence? Is that proof? One theory is that spirits are drawing energy from the devices themselves as they try to manifest. Another is that older houses, they have weird wiring or high EMFs. Either way, it's a common theme when it comes to ghost investigations. Tech goes haywire right when you need it the most. But anyway, back to the attic. Multiple witnesses, they noticed bizarre lights or like faint orbs, similar to what Jackie and Chrissy had seen in the kitchen. Jeff photographed some of these glowing shapes with his 35mm camera. Others inside the house would report a stench, almost as though something was decaying and was coming straight down from the rafters. Now, most of the strange happenings, they were unnerving but relatively harmless, except when it came to Jeff. He seemed to be the entity's favorite target. At one point, he felt only what he could describe as a massive, like a skeletal hand pressing into his back. The next day, he had severe back pain. In fact, it was so bad that he even considered getting medical attention. Now, poltergeists, they typically throw things or slam doors, but when it comes to actually harming somebody, there's very few cases where I know of this happening, with the exception of the infield poltergeist. Again, with infield, we covered that here on this very podcast. It was such a crazy experience because it even threw, I think it was Janice? I think her name was Janice. I mean, there's a very well-known photo of her being thrown into the air. I think it's probably the most iconic photograph in the history or in the annals of paranormal activity. It's just very weird that that would happen. And one of the things that I suggested when it came to infield was this was a way of fear and manipulate, which is something that the theory is that they almost ramp up their own energy based on that. So could it be that it's using this fear to possibly try to manifest itself, almost like stealing energy from a device? If anything, it's a thought process. Did the entity single Jeff out because he was just skeptical, or because it recognized something familiar about him? Later on, Jackie will have a Ouija board session that could possibly suggest this. I think we can all agree when physical harm enters the picture, it's kind of hard to dismiss as just mere coincidence. Now, eventually, everyone, they would regroup downstairs. As they would compare notes, they heard slow, very heavy footsteps pacing in the attic above. A sound one investigator described as, if it's a rat, it's got to be a 200-pound rat. A series of ominous thuds would echo through the laundry room. The investigators, they captured some of this on audio, but after a time, the noises, they would subside, Convinced that they had done all that they could possibly do that night, the team would pack up their gear and they left, despite Jackie's displeased pleas for them to please stay. Over the following weeks, Jackie endured more frightening activity, appliances that would flicker on and off by themselves, objects being hurled through the air yet again, and on several occasions, she was thrown to the floor, or even choked by an invisible force. 3 weeks later, terrified and exhausted, she phoned the investigators in the middle of the night. Now Jeff, he heard her frantic voicemail and he decided to return with just a few of the others. Jackie and her children, they waited on the porch while the team reached the house. For a long time, everything stayed eerily calm. Now eventually Jeff and a fellow investigator, Gary, would decide to check the attic yet again, the place where the worst activity seemed to be centered. Jackie stayed below, already on edge. Just as Jeff pulled himself through the very small hole, Gary heard a sharp snap in the darkness. Then there was silence. Jeff's glasses and flashlight had fallen to the attic floor. Unable to see, Gary lifted his camera and blindly fired off 2 flashing photos towards the sound. In that momentary burst of light, he caught a glimpse of Jeff pinned under a very low rafter, his eyes rolling back and his collar yanked high onto his neck by something thin and something white. It turned out to be a short piece of clothesline attached to a nail, almost like a makeshift noose. Gary scrambled forward and managed to pull Jeff free, shaken to the core. Jeff, half stumbling, half slid down the attic opening. Below the rest of the team, they looked almost horrified as they would shine their flashlight on Jeff's neck. One investigator, he would say what they were all thinking. If Gary hadn't acted so quickly, Jeff, he may have been strangled to death. Whatever force dwelled in the attic had just made his deadliest move yet. And from that point on, no one doubted the horrifying danger Jackie had been facing all alone. Now, during that same chaotic night, there was also a very disturbing incident that involved Jackie's baby. According to some of the versions of the story, Jackie would go and check on her children, and she would discover a very strange red slash on her infant daughter's forehead, almost like it was like a grease paint or like a lipstick that had not been there just moments before. Jackie took it as a direct warning from the entity, like a chilling message that could reach her children anytime, any place that it wanted. Although the baby didn't appear to be harmed physically, the mere sight of the mark was enough to send Jackie into a brand new height of fear. You know, one thing that I really want to talk about, when we talk about paranormal stories, there are stories of being possessed and possession and stuff like that. That is obviously a brand new line of terror. But when we talk about Jeff nearly being hung by a clothesline, have you ever heard of another case where that's actually happened? And then there's that very eerie red slash on the baby's forehead, almost like the silent warning, your children aren't safe. Reminds us that whatever's in the house, it doesn't have to be shy about trying to target somebody. But again, I've never heard of a case where that's ever happened before, that I know of anyway. I don't know. Just some food for thought. I'd love to know in the comments down below if you've ever heard of a situation where that's happened before. But anyway, after Jeff's terrifying brush with strangulation in the attic, the investigators, they noted that something paranormal seemed to happen every few minutes for the rest of the night. A gas stove would switch on by itself. Objects would float or shift across the floor. A loud crash sent poor Jeff slamming into the bookshelf. I'm sure he was probably tired of getting injured. By the end of it all, Jackie, she felt utterly drained, exhausted, and on the edge. Fearing for her children's safety, she left the house to stay with friends for a little while. But the disturbances, they followed her. Eventually, Jackie decided to move in with Al again at a trailer park in Weldon, California, about 200 miles away from San Pedro. She was nowhere near the location this entire story had taken place. If anything, she hoped for peace, but the unsettling activity continued. After only a few months, her marriage fell apart for a second time. Now on her own, Jackie began hearing scratches from a backyard shed, while strange orbs of light circled the trailer at night. One evening, as she and a neighbor carried a TV into the shed, its screen flickered, and in that flicker, they both glimpsed the same eerie sight of a corpse. The man like Jackie had seen sitting on her son's bunk bed, and he vanished as soon as they blinked. Later that same night, there was pounding noises that was thundering from inside the shed, as if someone or something was trapped and desperately trying to escape. With nowhere else to turn, Jackie again turned to Dr. Barry Taff and his investigation team. When they arrived in Weldon, their equipment had malfunctioned immediately. Cameras and recordings simply refused to turn on. They managed to only briefly get it to function, and that was all before every device would power down again. So again, we have an investigation team that just can't seem to get any kind of activity. Now, a lot of times when we talk about these hauntings, they're tied to a location, battlefield or a notorious old house. Others seem to be attached to a person. Jackie's troubles, they didn't just stop in San Pedro, they followed her. In my case as a kid, when I talk about possibly seeing my great-grandmother, it's very possible that it was attached to a dresser that was given to my parents. I guess in Jackie's case, it really begs the question, was this entity possibly bound to her rather than the house? And again, that goes back to the whole question about manifesting energies and things of that equivalent. Desperate for answers, Barry suggested a seance, something that they had not tried. Jackie also produced an old Ouija board, hoping that it could possibly help them communicate with whatever force was tormenting her and her family. So they would clear a table, and they would prepare to begin. Outside, the wind rattled the trailer, and a tense hush settled over all those that gathered inside. Jackie kept a handwritten journal of the events that would soon unfold, bracing herself for what might surface in the glow of the candles and the shadows of this final stand against the entity that had haunted her life for now so long. Through a Ouija board session, Jackie and the investigation team claimed that they had finally made contact with the entity plaguing her life. The presence identified itself as a man who had drowned in the San Pedro Bay back in 1930s, and whose alleged murderer had once lived in Jack's old house. Now, strangely, the spirit also claimed that there was another entity that was following Jackie, possibly the same one that manifests as lights that would come around her. When questioned about Jeff and the violent attack in the attic, the entity is supposedly said that it tried to kill him because Jeff looked very identical to the man responsible for his own murder in the 1930s. Satisfied as having explained itself, the spirit, it offered no further reason for why it would disturb Jackie, only a cryptic message about craving the energy that her turmoil created. Now, Dr. Barry Taff, he did a little bit of digging, and he found that there was a man, Herman Hendrickson, who was discovered floating under a pier in San Pedro Bay on March 25th of 1930, as reported by the local newspaper. Now, Taff, he believed that this man could be the very spirit behind the haunting, fueled by Jackie's ongoing stress and fear. Remarkably, After the seance concluded, the worst of the activity had stopped. The old man's corpse-like figure no longer appeared, and the swirling lights, they faded away. For good, it seemed. You know, when we talk about locations, and especially when it's haunted locations, I think we all try to go back to the history. And I think when we find things, it adds a little bit of credibility to possibly what the haunting is, especially if we know that there is haunting stories, and then there's a circumstance that kind of collaborates between the two with historical documents, like finding an old obituary or a newspaper article about someone who died under mysterious circumstances. If that man, the one that was found floating in the harbor, was the man that was haunting Jackie, does that imply that he was seeking justice? Or was it just a coincidence? Possibly it was a case where it was just a convenient name to match with local lore for the investigators. I would love to know your theories about that in the comments down below also. Now, later that year, Jackie moved back to Los Angeles. Only a handful of small incidents ever occurred again. There was one occasion, I probably should have mentioned this earlier, she claimed to have seen a glowing orb exit her former San Pedro home and float across into the sky before settling on a headstone of that of Mr. John Damon, who died in 1913. Possibly, they think that he was another victim of the same alleged killer. From then on, though, the light, it vanished and never came back. Now, both of Jackie's children survived the ordeal with very minimalistic, lingering effects, though her son Jamie, he was once thrown against a wall by an invisible force, and he dealt with chronic nightmares. Her daughter Samantha was too young to remember any of it. Jackie herself later described the haunting years as the lowest point in her life, filled with fear and depression. On top of the depression was the fact that everything in her world was crumbling, which makes a lot of times people wonder if this is what causes some of that poltergeist activity. Now, the story, it eventually found its way to various documentaries and television specials. Barry Conrad, one of the main investigators, released a documentary titled An Unknown Entity, a true account of the San Pedro Haunting of 1997, and later wrote a book on the same subject. Now, he and Jackie also appeared on TV shows in the 1990s. Those skeptics, they accused them of seeking fame, and rumors circulated they may have begun having a romantic relationship during the investigation. Now, Jackie, she stated that she never received a significant share of the profits, and there was no amount of small publicity that was worth reliving her terror. Meanwhile, the house in San Pedro has changed several times since then. Residents report sporadic thumping, foul odors in the attic, and unexplainable markings. Still nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to the violent intensity that Jackie experienced. Now, many believe that there's still something that remains trapped in the attic, bound to the walls like a residual echo of the past. Whether it's truly that of Herman, the man that was killed and left for dead floating in the water, or simply an unknown malevolent force feeding on Jackie's fear, one thing remains clear. To this day, the San Pedro Haunting stands out as one of the most unsettling and well-documented paranormal cases in modern times. So let me ask you a question. Is it possible that Jackie could have manifested these phenomena through intense emotion and stress? Poltergeist theories oftentimes involve a focal person under severe pressure. Or did investigators exploit her fear for a sensational story? Both angles keep swirling around in this case. Now, one thing that you got to understand, despite the shocking photographs, lab-tested plasma samples, the dramatic first-hand accounts, many people still question the true nature of Jackie's experiences. Now, skeptics point out that in moments of crisis, especially when it's a single parent and they have children, why would she never call the police? Why would she only rely on things such as paranormal investigators or investigative teams? I mean, most single parents would at least call the police. And if the activity was really as severe as what was reported, why hadn't Jackie went even further along that means, like talking to a shaman or possibly an exorcist? Others wonder if there could have been possibly a deliberate attempt to sensationalize the events. Jackie's life was in turmoil. Her marriage had collapsed. She was juggling work and parenting, and she was deeply afraid of being alone. Some suggest that her anxiety may have fueled a genuine paranormal manifestation, or just as plausibly might have led to amplified misinterpretations of just ordinary phenomena. Then there are the persistent rumors that Jackie had grown close to the investigator, Barry Conrad. Certain observers speculated that jealousy could have played into the aggressive role of Jeff, especially if stress or emotional tension was feeding poltergeist-like force. Still others hypothesize that there was a much more cynical angle. They think that maybe the investigation crew may have been capitalizing on Jackie's vulnerability just to produce dramatic footage, publish books, and create a documentary, which was potentially distorting her experiences for profit. In essence, the San Pedro Haunting, it offers no easy, tidy answers. On one hand, it stands out as a genuinely frightening example of violent activity, complete with photographic evidence, eyewitness accounts, and bizarre physical substances that allegedly tested positive as human blood plasma. But on the other, those same unsettling details, they are entangled with rumors of ulterior motives, incomplete investigations, and the undeniable fact that a stressful home, especially in a home like hers, situations can exacerbate all kinds of psychological phenomena. But for Jackie, the ordeal, it was very real and deeply traumatic. Now, whether interpreted as just the good old classic example of aggressive poltergeist feeding on that of emotional turmoil, or the more sinister side of a tragic situation where a savvy investigation team exploits for publicity, the haunting remains one of the most widely discussed and fiercely debated cases in modern American paranormal history. You know, the San Pedro Haunting, it lands into that very intriguing gray zone. Credible enough to fascinate believers, questionable enough to fuel skeptics. After weighing the evidence, I'll be honest, I'm kind of torn. Maybe there's more truth to Jackie's story than we'll ever know, or maybe the real explanation is buried under the hype and the half-truths. Where do you stand? I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. I sure would if you've made it this far into the podcast. I would appreciate it if you've not hit that like button, if you could do that. Let me know in the comments down below some of the things that even I'm questioning in this story. And if you've not subscribed, what are you waiting on? I'd love to have you. I'd love to tell you more stories. Also, YouTube thinks that you'll enjoy this episode that's right here on the screen. Let me know if it chose correctly. Until I see you in the next video or the next podcast, goodbye.